which gives me an absolutely beautiful garment that I absolutely love, but it takes ages to knit. Hello and welcome to The Art of Pointy Things, a channel where I discuss my adventures in knitting, sewing and other similar crafts. I am Dusty, and in this video I'll be going through my design process for when I make knitted garments but not following a pattern and using my own measurements. I will be specifically using my recently finished knitted seed stitch sweater vest as the documentation and explanation of how I got to the pattern for this. This is not a tutorial or a guide on how to do this. This is just a summary of my thought process behind how I do this. I personally quite like knowing how other people do things like this because it's such a varied topic. So I thought I'd share my own process. So first point is sort of why I do this. So I am on the edge of, depending on your definition, I'm on the edge of being plus sized, or I am plus sized. And as many people who sort of knit and sew know, body types and shapes vary dramatically even at different sizes. And I've always struggled to find clothes that I like and that I like the fit of at my size. And as a result of this, a few years back, I actually started sewing my own clothing because I was just struggling to find in store what I liked at a price I could afford. But I found that even with just commercial sewing patterns, I was struggling to get them to fit right, and then all the modifications I was making, it was just such a lot of work that I ended up just deciding that I may as well just draft the pattern from scratch. So with that, I sort of have no training bar YouTube and blog posts. I also have this book, which I do recommend for anybody who wants to pick up pattern drafting for sewing. It's Metrics Pattern Cutting for Women's Wear by Winifred Aldrich. I'll leave a note down in the description. But between that and just trying to figure things out for myself by trial and error when it comes to construction, I managed to get clothes that fit. And last year it occurred to me, you know, why not expand that to knitting? Now there are some key differences with knitting. The main being that you're making the fabric as you go, and the rules that apply to darts and things don't necessarily apply. You don't have seams, and you can really, it's a lot more freeing than sewing. It does take a lot more time because you have to sort of create the fabric from scratch, but I found that there were a few things I could do that I just really liked. So I was sort of going by trial and error. You know, this isn't perfect. As I said, I'm not an expert in this at all. It's just I enjoy watching videos about what other people do, and I thought I'd share that. So on to the actual design process. The first thing I do is I figure out what I want. So this is my clearly very extensive design sheet. I basically, somewhere I have some templates for people because I cannot draw, and I just make a note of what I want. So this is knitted vest design from January 2022. Fitted vest with negative ease, textured C-stitch body, rib neck, arm openings and bottom edge. I'll get onto the changes in a moment. Form fitted and structured, not drapey. Knitted bottom up in the round till arm side and then flat up to shoulders. So what I've decided with this is, you know, what it's going to look like, where it's going to fit sort of at the bottom, at the top, how close it's going to fit at the arms and the neck. And then just made some notes so it's, you know, it's fitted with 0 to negative ease. For example, I've noticed that I wanted a textured C-stitch body. This actually came after I knit my tank top, and the increases and decreases that I included were very obvious, and I sort of wanted them to be not quite so obvious. So I thought if I used a pattern, something like seed stitch, which is a very busy looking pattern, the increase and decreases would disappear. Now, you can see this was not actually intended originally, so it's not listed on this page, but you can actually see that you can't see the slanting stitches so much. They get lost, so that you can see this line is a centre for an increase and decrease row. And you can't see the directions of the stitch so easily. So I did actually achieve that. And that is sort of things to consider is, you know, what stitch pattern do you like? The other thing for me is that I wanted to knit in the round. And for me, purling takes a little bit longer than knitting. So something like a C stitch, which is knit one, purl one, it's the same. One thing to consider when I was sort of talking about knitting in the round is, you know, if you're doing garter stitch, it makes more sense to knit flat because then you're knitting every stitch. But if you're doing something like C stitch or ribbing, it doesn't necessarily matter whether you knit flat or in the round. It's your preference. Do you mind sewing up seams or not? Because it's knit one, purl one, which is the same in the round as it is flat. So there's that. If you were paying attention to when I showed that, you will note that the neck opening is not ribbed. It's actually an I-cord edge. So I do change things depending on, especially when I'm constructing them, what needs to change. So once I sort of have an idea of the shape I want and everything, what I then do is, this is a very basic, just small scale body block. So if you know sewing, you'll recognise this. If I had the measurements correct, I could put this on and it would make me a very basic shirt. No sleeves, but very basic. And what I then do with this is, you'll see there's a lot of notes, but the first thing I do is I get this out and I actually make a note of if there's anything I want to change. So with this one in particular, I didn't. You know, I might make the arm side, you know, this is technically fitted, but with the measurements, I'll make the notes of where the arm side and the neck holes will be bigger or smaller. But it's sort of also where I want the darts to go, or what would be darts in sewing, but it's the increases and decreases. So I want them along the side seam. You can see I've got some triangles drawn of how I want the darts to sit, where I want the peaks and everything. And then, so it's basically the black lines are the most important of just the shape of I want. With the vest, it's very easy. It is basically just the basic block with some increases around the bust area and increases and decreases in the side seam. Right, then the next thing is measurements. If you don't, like, this is actual page with my actual measurements on. If this is upsetting to you, then just skip ahead and I will put when I stop showing it. You can't probably read it very well, but I just, you know, I know some people struggle with that sort of thing. So from this, and this is very much based on my knowledge of pattern drafting for sewing, I then figure out what measurements I need, which is what all of these red arrows indicate. So that is all of the measurements I took, and then I've given them names that only I will understand most likely. And I've attained these measurements. Thing to note when getting measurements is that you really should have somebody else do it. And I think that's what caused the problem with this, is, you know, with some of the fit issues, is that I was measuring myself, and measuring yourself is never as accurate as getting somebody else to measure it for you. I mean, there are guides and stuff to doing it, but it's not as easy as getting your measurements. And so then, I measured in centimetres, by the way, if you are very interested in what my body looks like. I then take it back to this, and I basically just fill out all of my measurements. What I do is, I've decided I'm knitting bottom up. I should probably mention this, and I've broken the body up into 4 sections. So you have the front left, front right, back left and back right. And then what's important for me, and what I find a lot of patterns, sewing, knitting in general don't accommodate, at least very simple ones, the ones I've done, is that for me, my front, you know, my bust may be 110, but my front bust is not 55, my back bust is not 55. There is a difference, and I find a lot of patterns don't always accommodate that, and that's something I wanted to include in this. So I measure my front bust, I then calculate my back bust, and I then go through, and from the bottom up, I go through each dimension and then label it so that I know which section it should be. And I transfer a lot of the diagonal measurements into the vertical and horizontal, sometimes using trigonometry, because I've got to make everything really complicated. If it's not complicated, is it really a good project? That's a joke, by the way. It's simple. I've done simple things. I love simple things, but sometimes I accidentally overcomplicate things. And then, so once I figure out the dimensions, the sizes of where I want, so, you know, I've got things marked like how far in from there I want the arm side, the peak of the arm side to sit, and how far apart the peak of my bust is, and where basically I'm trying to figure out exactly where every dimension, every point of knitting I've listed. So this is the bottom of the shirt, hip line, waistline, under bust, bust line, bottom of arm side, over bust, and that's sort of the horizontal sections. And as I said, I've got the 4 vertical sections, and then within that, what's the slope of the shoulder that I want, what's the slope of the neckline I want. And then the next point is to gauge swatch. So we're probably safe here. I'm probably not going to actually mention my measurements again, but after, so if you did skip that, so what I've just done is I took my measurements and then I put them onto my body block, dividing up into each section. The next step is then gauge swatch. So the benefit of not having a pattern is there's not a specific gauge to meet. You just take the yarn you want, which in this case was Holst Super Soft Held Double, needles that you think will be about right, and you knit the square. And then, especially with Holst, I had to wash it multiple times to get the proper drape of how it would feel. And, is this too drapey? Do I need to maybe hold it 3 times, or do I need to use a smaller needle? Wasn't particularly keen on using a smaller needle because I was already knitting at quite a small gauge, because it's the slight problem with me is that I don't like these loose, drapey, open fabrics. So it means I have to use very small needle sizes for the yarn, which gives me an absolutely beautiful garment that I absolutely love, but it takes ages to knit. And that is something to consider, And I looked at this and, things to consider: if it's a bottom layer, can you see through it? And if I stretch it, there are holes, but then this is worn over another shirt. It's not a base layer. So I don't necessarily mind if there's a little bit of light coming through, which I think is possibly more a factor of seed stitch than, I don't really know. Because I'm knitting in the round, I also knit my swatch in the round. So I have the loose back threads at the back. So then, knit the gauge swatch, measure gauge, which is what this page is. So this is just what my gauge is. I measure it. You can see that for stitches in rows, I measure it at multiple points, and then average that. Measured after watching, and so for example for this project I settled on 3.75mm needles. For the main body I think I did drop to a smaller size for the ribbing and the edging in general. So after you calculate your gauge, or after I calculate my gauge, the next thing I need to figure out is how many stitches in 1 centimetre, and how many centimetres in 1 stitch. The same for rows. How many rows in 1 centimetre, how many centimetres is 1 row. Then you get your trusty calculator out, and all of the measurements, which I'm not going to show, but all of the measurements then need to be transferred into stitch counts and row counts and things like that. And that's where these pages come in. No, I will never scan these and put these online, because I definitely write in a way that I'm the only person who understands it. So, for example, using the bottom circumference, I figure out how many cast-on stitches I will use. Then I've sort of got, I want 5 centimetres of 1x1 rib. And then the next thing I do is I place all my markers. And one thing you will notice is there is some colour coding in here. So for example, the green are the underarm seams, the orange is the centre back seam, and the blue are the bust seams. So they're almost princess seams over the bust to give bust shaping. Bust shaping. Because that's sort of one of my big pet peeves, is that when things aren't shaped in this area and I just look as big as I am at my bust all over, and I don't think that looks flattering on me, and I don't like the way it looks on me. One thing I do want to say, I'd probably not the place I probably should have said at the beginning, but I really don't want to come across as judging what other people choose to wear. People like the style of clothing that they wear. That's fine. Like you wear what you want to wear. I'm just struggling to find what I want to wear, and that's why I do this. This is definitely not a you should wear garments exactly like me. Wear what you want. This is just, I prefer the much more fitted style than other people, and that's fine, and people can wear what they want. You don't have to, just because you're plus size doesn't mean you have to wear baggy clothing. You still have a body you can show off. So I use colour coding for the markers so that I know which marker is which. And actually when I was knitting it, I probably don't have any footage I can show, but my stitch markers, my markers on my needles, colour coordinated with the notes here. So I had green marker at the underseam, I had an orange marker in the centre back, I had a blue marker on the bust when I was using it. And basically I just go through, and so for example, this is from, where am I? Okay, so I think here, yeah, I struggled to read this after I finished the garment, so here, this is from hip to waist. And you can see I've got the note 4 centimetres in 15 and 1.5 in 15. So the distance is 15. That's the number of rows. So I've made a note here of 51 rows. And then how many stitches I have to, in this point, decrease. So I have to decrease 7.36 or 2.76. You will deal with a lot of decimals. And this is sort of where negative versus positive Eve comes into for me. One thing I probably should mention with the measurements is sometimes if you really want a tight or a very loose garment, just add on to your bust and your hips, and if you want long, then decide where you want that length to sit. You know, if you want to move your waistline, you can sort of fiddle with those numbers to get the garment that you want. I will admit, if you know what you're doing, it can take a bit to get an idea of which bit you can and can't increase. So where, I measured where the arm size sits, and then I actually changed some of the measurements so that it sat actually a bit further in. And that's something, so many things I keep forgetting to mention. With the ribbing, when you add, so my plan was to knit the body and then to add the ribbing on for the neckline and the sleeves afterwards. When you do that, you need to remember to take off some of the neckline measurements and the ribbing measurements. So when you measure these bits, you then take off a few centimetres because, however many centimetres that the ribbing is going to be, so in my case 5 centimetres, so that the ribbing sits to the edge of the garment where you want it. I hope that makes sense. And then you just go through and figure out the rows and columns. The curves are tricky, I'm just going to say that now. It's actually why I started with the tank top and then moved on to this. You can read a lot of guides about how curves should look, but what I tended to do is just cast off a bunch of stitches right at the bottom for, say, the neckline, here, right at the bottom, and then decrease evenly for a bit. And that gives you, that's actually what this is. This neckline here is nothing more simple than actually a straight line at the bottom here, and then a couple of diagonals, and then that's basically straight as well. So it's less a circle and more the bottom half of a octagon? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, sort of the bottom half of an octagon. So flat, diagonal, flat. And the thing is, when you add your sort of neckline and when it sits, it does naturally much more curve. You can't see so much that it's a bunch of straight lines. So that's, that's how I did that. But actually, whilst I'm discussing curves and stuff, you can see here, I thought I had taken out the measurement here for how, I measured where I want my neckline to sit and then had taken out a few centimetres so I could have that ribbing. But then when I finished the garment and I put it on, I realised that the neckline basically sat exactly where I wanted it to sit in the end. So I swapped to an I-cord edging so that I wouldn't then A, either have to rip this all out and re-knit it, and B, so that it would sit and it would be finished. And actually, I'm really happy that I ended up doing that, because I wear this with a lot of collared shirts and the ribbing will probably sit a bit weirdly with them, whereas this sits just nicely under the collar. So I really like how this has turned out. But yeah, so, I mean, that's it from there, and then you just knit, and you keep measuring as you go and rip out if it's wrong. And I mean, honestly, don't be afraid to rip back. When you're making things like this, just generally, it's one of my tips, is don't be afraid to rip back. But that's sort of all the paperwork associated with the thing I made. And as I said, I'm really happy with it. And I mean, you can probably see a lot of my inspiration from sewing patterns, especially when it comes to like this block. This is a sewing pattern that I filled out. And knitting, you know, really does give you a lot of very interesting options, because, you know, I the way I've done this dart, I couldn't do with fabric without putting a seam here, or without having a seam all the way up to the shoulder. There's a reason princess seams go all the way up to the shoulders, because you can't just reduce the fabric in that way without either having a seam there or a seam up there. But with knitting, you know, you can just get, you know, this is a seamless garment, because, you know, it's got faux seams. I probably haven't mentioned, I centered my increase and decreases around a reverse stockinette up the front, so you can just sort of see there's a bit of a line which is more obvious on the inside. And it sort of gives faux seams, which I think is actually quite an interesting visual element. But, you know, I didn't have to sew anything together, which is really nice, because I don't necessarily enjoy sewing knitting together. It can be a bit weird and complex. But that's it. If you have any questions, if I have said anything at all that's confusing, please leave them down below. I will put some links, you know, to things that have helped me over the years figure out how to shape and how to increase and decrease and things like that. And how to approach this. But this is very much how I approach knitting pattern design, I suppose. I'm not planning on publishing any patterns, I just do it in the same way I do sewing, just because I enjoy having clothes that fit me the way I want them to fit me. So go forth and make clothes that you enjoy, that you want to wear. Don't just put up with what society tells you should be wearing. Wear what you want. And if people judge you, well then they've got way too much time on their hands. You know, life's too short to worry about some of these things. So thank you for watching. If you want more details on the actual finished vest, episode 9 of my monthly knitting roundup, I haven't quite settled on a name, which will be linked up at the top somewhere. I will link episode 9. Check out some of my other content, you know. I make a variety of things based around knitting and sewing, so I hope you find some content you like. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a comment down below, and consider subscribing if you want to see more content. I do a monthly, it's meant to be monthly, I think I missed out on May, sorry, sort of roundup of what I've been knitting and sewing, so please catch that if you're interested. But anyway, I hope you have a lovely day.